Respiration has two meanings: utilization of oxygen in the metabolism of organic molecules by cells, which we term as internal or cellular respiration, as described in Chapter 3, and the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between an organism and the external environment, called pulmonary physiology. The adjective pulmonary refers to the lungs. The second meaning is the subject of this chapter. The respiratory system serves many vital functions. It provides oxygen to the blood. It also eliminates carbon dioxide from the blood. The respiratory system regulates the blood's hydrogen ion concentration and therefore the pH in coordination with the kidneys. The respiratory system also forms speech sounds, intonation, and defends against inhaled microbes. The lungs influences arterial concentrations of chemical messengers by removing some from pulmonary capillary blood and producing and adding others to the blood. The lungs also traps and dissolves blood clots arising from systemic veins, such as from those from the legs. The organs that comprises the respiratory system includes the nasal cavity, which opens up anteriorly as the pair of nostrils, and then the pharynx, which is the common passageway of air and food, and then the pharynx sends down to the larynx, which is heavily supported by cartilages, rings of cartilages, the most prominent of which at the top is the thyroid cartilage, and then the larynx extends down to a long rigid tube, which is also supported by cartilages, which we call the trachea, and then the trachea branches off at the posterior end into two branches that enters the lungs. We call these branches of the trachea as bronchi, and the bronchi enters the lungs and progressively divides into thinner and thinner branches we call bronchioles. And then the bronchioles end up in spherical hollow air-filled spaces called alveoli. The, the nasal cavity down to the bronchioles that allows for passage of air in and out of the lungs are generally classified as conducting zone, whereas the terminal bronchioles and the air sacs that is formed by alveoli that has walls that are already very thin, which allows for exchanges of gases between blood and these air spaces. We call these terminal ends of the bronchioles as respiratory zones, which allows for exchange of gases between blood and the air spaces in the alveoli and bronchioles. So this other figure here shows the progressively thinning branches of the trachea and bronchi and bronchioles. But if you sum up all the branches, you will have inversely a greater number of branches down to the ends of the bronchioles than there are starting from the bronchi. So the uh, spaces that is formed by the bronchioles, especially the respiratory bronchioles and alveoli, is a very large space that allows for tremendously efficient exchange of gases between blood and the lungs. The conducting zone of the respiratory system serves several functions. One is that it provides low resistance for airflow. Resistance is physiologically regulated by changes in the diameter of the airways, which in turn is due to contraction of smooth muscles around the airways and by physical forces acting upon the airways. The conducting zone also defends against microbes, toxic chemicals, and other foreign matter You have cilia, mucus, and macrophages that help perform this function of defense. The conducting zone also warms up and moistens the air, especially at the uh, nasal cavity, which you have nasal conchae that provides for moistening and warming of air that enters into the lungs. And then finally, the respiratory system also participates in sound production with the use of the vocal folds that vibrate whenever air is forced out of the vocal folds, thus producing sound, which we use for speech and other ways. In the human lungs, there are nearly 500 million alveoli, each of which is around 1 over 128 inches or zero point 0.2 millimeters in diameter. Taken together, the alveoli represents a very large surface area over which gas exchange can take place. Each alveolus is surrounded by a network of capillaries, which is supplied by the pulmonary arteries that run alongside the bronchioles. Blood in the capillary is then drained by the pulmonary venules, which also runs parallel along the arteries. The air that gets into the alveoli is never therefore far from blood vessels for exchange of gases. The cells that make up the alveolar walls are of two kinds, the type 1 and the type 2 alveolar cells. The type 1 alveolar cells are squamous epithelial cells that make up most of the alveolar wall. The alveoli are air-filled but moist spaces in the lungs. Its interior is normally moist due to a thin film of water secreted by the type 1 alveolar cells. Because of this moisture, gases of oxygen and carbon dioxide can easily diffuse between blood and alveoli. But this film of water also tends to collapse the alveoli due to surface tension of water. The second cell type in the alveoli, however, the so-called type 2 alveolar cell, prevents surface tension from collapsing the alveoli. This is because the type 2 alveolar cells secrete surfactants. These are lipid-rich secretion that decreases the surface tension of the alveolar wall. To move between air and blood, oxygen and carbon dioxide have to cross the respiratory membrane, which comprises mainly of the walls of the alveolar wall, the alveoli, and their surrounding capillaries. Both of these are just one cell layer thick, so the distance that molecules of oxygen and carbon dioxide must travel is very, very thin. The exchange of gases through the respiratory membranes occurs possibly by diffusion, wherein gases transfer from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. Oxygen dissolves into the surfactant and water layers of the alveoli before entering the blood, while carbon dioxide diffuses the opposite way from blood into the alveolar air. To understand the mechanics of breathing, it is important to mention here that the lungs do not have a capacity to expand or compress its own volume. It relies on the expansion and compression of the thoracic wall around it. Normally, the lung surface, which is the visceral pleura, is strongly adhered to the wall, the parietal pleura of the thoracic cavity, because of the intrapleural fluid, much like a cellophane that adheres strongly to a wet surface. So whenever the thoracic wall expands, the lungs expands too, and vice versa. Note that the intrapleural fluid shown here is highly exaggerated, when in reality it is a very, very thin film of water, only a few millimeters thick. Breathing or ventilation involves two cyclic events, inspiration and then followed by expiration, and this cycle repeats over and over again. Basic mechanism of ventilation involves Boyle's law of gases, which dictates that when there is a change in volume of a contained gas, it always leads to changes in air pressure within it. This simple law of gases determines the direction of air whenever the lungs are expanded or compressed. When respiratory muscles contract and causes the lungs to expand, the air pressure inside it drops below atmospheric pressure. And so, the atmospheric air being higher in pressure rushes to the lung interior where air pressure is low. Inversely, when the lungs are compressed during relaxation of respiratory muscles, the air pressure inside it is compressed and raised above atmospheric pressure, and thus air rushes out of the lungs.
And so, airflow or F into or out of the lungs is basically determined by the difference of air pressures. This is expressed by the equation shown in this slide. The equation shows here there are two main determinants of airflow. One is the pressure difference between the alveoli and the atmosphere, and two, the resistance of the passageway of air. Resistance in turn is determined principally by the diameter of the passageway of air. When the diameter of the passageway is reduced, it increases resistance. When the diameter of the passageway is increased, it decreases resistance. Now the relationship between difference of pressure and resistance is that when there is greater difference of pressure than there is resistance, flow is increased. Whereas when there is lesser pressure difference than there is resistance, flow is hindered.
Earlier, we mentioned that the lung surfaces is adhered to the thoracic wall by an intrapleural fluid. The question is, how does this intrapleural fluid determine the expansion or compression of the lung? This is done by the changes between the difference of the pressure between the intrapleural fluid pressure and the alveolar pressure, the so-called transpulmonary pressure. When we inspire, the transpulmonary pressure increases, which makes the lung surfaces strongly adhere to the thoracic wall as it expands. Thus, the lungs also expands. When we expire or breathe out, the transpulmonary pressure decreases, and so the lungs relaxes and compresses together with the thoracic wall.
In between inspiration and expiration, the transmural pulmonary pressures balance out each other. At the end of inspiration, inherent elastic recoil, that is the tendency to collapse the lungs, is equal to the transpulmonary pressure tending to expand the lungs. At the end of expiration, inherent elastic recoil of the thoracic wall tending to compress the chest is equal to the compressed elastic chest wall to expand. In all this, there is no all over overall flow of air into and out of the lungs, and the atmospheric pressure is equal to that of the alveolar pressure, which is zero. The events leading to inspiration starts with this. Inspiration is initiated by neural signals to the respiratory muscles. The signals come from the medulla oblongata of the brain. These signals induces contraction of the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles located between the ribs. The diaphragm is the most important inspiratory muscle that acts during normal quiet breathing. When activation of the motor neurons within the phrenic nerves innervating the diaphragm, this causes the diaphragm to contract. Its dome moves downward into the abdomen, enlarging the thorax. The intercostal nerves to the inspiratory intercostal muscles causes them to contract, leading up to an upward and outward movement of the ribs and a further increase in thoracic size. Altogether, contraction of these respiratory muscles expands the thorax. The intrapleural fluid drops to the subatmospheric pressures. This increases the transpulmonary pressure, pulling and expanding the lungs outward. Alveolar pressures becomes subatmospheric as well, and thus causes atmospheric air to rush into the alveoli. The events leading to expiration happens in the following. First, respiratory signals from the medulla oblongata stops and lets the respiratory muscles relax. The chest wall recoils, leading to compression of the thoracic wall. Compression of the thoracic wall decreases the intrapleural fluid pressures, which in turn decreases the transpulmonary pressures. The lungs recoil to their original volume, compressing the alveoli. The alveolar pressure becomes greater than atmospheric pressure, and this leads to air flowing out of the lungs. Respiration does not only involve the exchanges of gases between lungs and atmosphere, which we call as ventilation. Respiration also involves the transport of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, between the alveolar air and blood in the lung capillaries by diffusion. And then following this event, the gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, has to pass through blood vessels, through pulmonary and systemic circulation by bulk flow. And then followed by this, you have exchanges of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the blood in tissue capillaries and cells in tissues by diffusion. And then this oxygen and carbon dioxide flows into or out of the sites of cellular respiration, particularly at the mitochondria, where they are used, that is for oxygen, for cellular respiration, and the end product of one of the waste product of cell respiration, which is carbon dioxide, is made to flow out by diffusion out of the mitochondria and out of the cell. So all these movements of gases are also involved in respiration, besides movement of gases between lungs and air. That's the end of part 1 of chapter 13 on respiration, and next slide we will be talking about many more mechanisms of respiration and other laws that are involved with it.